Hello, and welcome to this episode of Supervision Simplified. How are you doing?
Hi, Valarie. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. We are going to start this episode a little differently and let you get a little peek into our everyday world. And I'm either Kelly or Regis. We're not sure yet, or Hoda,
Right, right.
or
Hoda or Jenna. Right, exactly.
yeah, or Jenna. So you
I think
start.
you are definitely Hoda. There's no doubt. I don't watch that show very often, but she's definitely like super. She knows all about all the celebrities. I think she knows all the current music. She's totally hip. And not that Jenna isn't hip or anything, but I think she's a little bit like more conservative, probably like maybe a little calmer. I don't know. Anyway, you can
That sounds like our brand.
tell us if they observe us, they can tell us who embodies Hoda, who embodies Jenna. I don't know. The Regis and Kelly thing, I don't know. I that's an up in the air,
I'm definitely not a Regis at
but there's
all,
no
but I
way
don't know that you're a Regis either.
I'm definitely not a Kelly. I mean,
I'm definitely a
gosh.
little more of a Kelly, but it really sounds I'm definitely a little more of a Kelly, but I really as you just put it, it does sound like I might be really a Hoda and you may be a Jenna.
I'm probably more of a Regis than a Kelly. You're probably more.
Really?
I don't
Wow. Yeah, I'm definitely more of a Kelly.
know.
I mean, yeah,
I
I watched her on All My Children growing up, and she definitely knows the celebs, and yeah, she knows all the things.
I'd like to be her. So okay, so we're gonna just take a couple minutes. We're not gonna take a long time because we're probably gonna lose listeners with our boring lives. But I do know you had some fun yesterday, and I wanted to tell you a funny story. So I was preparing for our recording today, and I put my coffee mug under um my my Mecca, which is my coffee machine, and I have an espresso, and my dog is so aggressive in the morning with like getting outside that she ran down through the kitchen, and she was so aggressive that she hit the counter, and I didn't notice this, and it moved my coffee cup off the like coffee machine, and so my coffee made itself all over the counter, and I was like, oh no, like I was so upset because I only had about a minute and a half until we had to record. And I thought, oh no, now I have to clean up all this coffee and make coffee. And I know that's not a really big deal for people, but I thought I really was looking forward to having my coffee while we were recording. And meanwhile, there's coffee all over the counter, and then the dog's licking it up. And anyway, I just thought it was a funny story.
Yeah,
So, mornings happen like that, right?
they do. They do. Yes, they do. Are dogs allergic to coffee? Is that one of the things? Like,
I
I've
don't think so. I
recently
think only
realized, like,
chocolate and raisins.
okay, okay.
Yeah,
That makes
so
sense.
and you had a
Okay.
good day yesterday?
I did. My niece placed 3rd in the state of Tennessee at the ripe old age of 7, um, in a state championship for wrestling, and she qualified with the girls and the boys, and this is only her 1st year in wrestling, and, the fascinating thing about this, so my husband was a wrestler, and here's what's so fascinating. I saw more children authentically crying yesterday. And when I mean authentically crying, they cry authentically at all ages. Like, I don't mean that, but I mean there's purpose-driven crying around I'm disappointed because my mom told me I can't get this, or I'm upset because I probably need a nap and a snack. You know what I mean? Those are still
Right,
authentic reasons for crying.
right.
This, what I mean by that is it's a soul level type of crying and of
Oh,
all ages, kids as young as like 7 and 8, all the way up to because this was all the way up to middle school. So they were really young. Most of these kids were like K through second or like third and fourth grade, and boys and girls, but just, I mean, that deep tears. And you could just see this sadness on their little faces. And so I'm looking at my husband and I'm like, I mean, we have a son that does football and lacrosse and has won all kinds of championships. And like, I've seen boys cry in sports. I get it. But what struck me as so young, they felt this like, and it
right,
wasn't, I don't even think it was just the loss. And my husband has always said that wrestling is the only sport that's an individual sport.
right,
Like, it is so heartfelt and your whole emotional processes out there with you, and you're
Absolutely.
also physically exhausting so much at once. And so, like, it was really beautiful to see all these parents managing this well, when I feel like so often in sports, you just see parents managing things really poorly for kids and their nervous systems. And there was definitely some of that too. And I had to walk away at times, and I had to like not go and educate people when I wanted to. But by and large, it was really beautiful to see these kids pouring their heart and soul into something that they really felt passionate about, and like learning to feel that defeat of, it just wasn't my time, and seeing their parents support them in that. So I just thought that was really pretty
That's
cool.
gorgeous. I think first of all, that your that your niece is wrestling, I think is in and of itself gorgeous. And my brother was a wrestler, and I remember watching them and seeing their bodies contort and their shoulders like dislocate. It's so just the visceral feeling of that I recall very clearly. And I will say that we see lots, in my group practice, we work with lots of children and teens. We see quite a few eating disordered clients that
Yes,
wrestle. So that's
that's
a
right.
big risk in the wrestling field. But on the flip side, I do appreciate that individualized sport, and that's really, and I like the genuineness of that. That's pretty exciting.
I
And I'm
love
sorry
sports
to hear.
psychology, so
Yeah,
it's a favorite of mine, and I too have worked with a lot of wrestlers, and there's a lot of eating disorders in that, but it was very neat to be on the fan side of it, because that was a new experience for me. And of course, as a photographer, I'll break into the sport with the photography piece too. But
right.
that I learned so much behind a lens watching sports, and
Yeah.
there's a lot to learn from coaches as supervisors and leaders, and
Yeah. And
that's a big thing for me too. I look to a lot of sports coaches to inform my work.
yeah, well done, Valerie, because that was a great segue to our topic today, because we're going to
Yes.
be talking really about sort of the role invocation of the supervisor, and how, supervision is a bit like coaching and a bit like counseling and a bit like teaching in all of those different kinds of ways, and how supervision encompasses those that kind of trifecta in its role. And you know we have to look at, as supervisors, we have to look at the layers that are involved in each of the dynamics of each of those roles, and merge them. And I really am quite convinced that it's an art as well as a skill.
Mhm.
And I've been saying lately, I'm going to die on the hill. I've been dying on a lot of hills lately, so I have to really be careful which hills I'm picking. But I'm really very starting to feel very strongly about this idea that there's more to the ability to supervise than just the skills. I
Yes.
really do think that there's a lot more about it than that. So what do you think? Talk to me about, or talk to our audience a little bit more about the roles: coaching, teaching, counseling, because I have brought to our conversation today one of our resources. And of course, we'll put these in our show notes. We're going to get better about show notes so that our audience starts having some resources, not only to reference, but also to download. So I brought
Mhm.
to our conversation today the Supervision Essentials. This is a very practical book, a very frequently referenced book. It's the Carol Follender and Edward Shafransky Supervision Essentials for the Practice of Competency-Based Supervision. This is the book. Whoops, wait, there it is. Right here. So I have it a little bit marked up, you can see. And I brought that to our conversation today. And so we'll reference it a little bit. But talk to our audience, Valerie, from your perspective, and then we'll dive into the literature around about this coaching, teaching, counseling kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think, there are components of each that I know there are multiple like tasks even associated with each that sort of not really overlap, but they're one and the same, but maybe the way it's done is differently. So, part of coaching, I think about, there's always going to be an evaluative process. So you're giving some level of feedback. at different times, feedback on what's working, feedback on what's not working, but also, giving suggestions on what may work. And I feel like at times coaching can be more prescriptive, but not always, depending on the nature of the situation at hand. And the same with the teaching, it's going to have an evaluative component to it, but that's going to look different than coaching. Coaching in sports, at least, has film. So, the coaching process could definitely, when you're giving feedback to a clinician, could use that film of looking at sessions and sitting with them side by side and looking at the techniques or different things that, we have a coding form that looks at different trauma skills, and things, and looking at attunement and pacing. So you could do it in that way. In the teacher role, it could be more in the form of assessment or testing, um, or just, of course, you do their midterm evaluations for students and things of that nature. And then in the counseling role, I think a lot of times that looks to me anyway like feedback on the relational aspect.
Right.
So just as you would with a client, just as with a client, the counselor client relationship is the single most important aspect of therapy and the best predictor of therapy, regardless of modality, homework, training, anything. And likewise, the supervision relationship is 100% the same. So the supervisor supervisee relationship is the core of where that goes and how it's working. And what's different in that, I think, from counseling as a therapist is that you're, going to frequently acknowledge that power differential and looking at that and checking on that. And so that I feel like the conversations are a little more candid in a different way than they would be with a client. Although candid, I just think that it's different because they have the terminology for it. So it's, how's our trust? How's our vulnerability? Or do you feel comfortable sharing things in here with me? And even considering self disclosure. If I'm self disclosing to a supervisee, is that focused on me and my need or something that's relevant and helpful to them? And how is it landing with them? So, again, similar to a role as a therapist and yet very different.
Yeah, I think thank you for sharing all those thoughts. I do agree. One of the challenges that I know that lots of people comment about, and let's talk, we'll go back and we'll kind of reflect on all three of those, but let's start with the counseling part because especially for new clinicians coming into the field, there's lots of conflict or confusion maybe around the role of their supervisor when the counselor, when the supervision seeker, the new clinician is in distress or is having difficulty in their own personal life. Maybe they're having a grief experience. Maybe they're having some kind of boundary difficulty with a client. Maybe they're experiencing some countertransference. All different kinds of things, all things that are normal that we've all experienced, and maybe the outside the normal, but all kinds of those kinds of things. And it is never the role of the supervisor to be the therapist for the supervisee. And as close a relationship as you might have, that continues to never be the role. And yet, you're required as the supervisor to draw on your experience and your counseling skills to support the supervisee in figuring out how to navigate that and get support in that.
Do
So,
you think, just to add to that, because I wanted to see about some clarification, because this is something where I think listeners could get confused because initially I think it was a little confusing to me. I'm going through the ACS course right now. And so as I'm doing that work, I noted very like often where it states that counselor, you are the role of the counselor, like you do, that is an expected role, but they will never use the word therapist. And so, and so what I think you're pointing to is the very nuanced differences between that. Sort of like I often see people listing master's level clinicians as therapists. In as my understanding is that they should never be listed as a therapist because they do not hold a license. They are a clinician or a master's level counselor. So in our practice, everyone are we house them under clinicians and our, policies, procedures, things of that sort, but their title in our practice is a master's level counselor. They do not get the role of therapist until they have a license. And so when I think of counselor and counseling, I think of those basic counseling skills, which it almost sounds like what you're talking about and what you would draw from, versus being the therapist, which would be applying those interventions and diagnosis and treatment planning, which some of that goes into counselor role too. But that's how I differentiate them. Would that be what you're referring to also?
Yes, exactly. So separate from your question about the role in terms of licensure, which is ridiculously complicated, and I think
Yeah,
we
yeah,
have to
yeah.
spend, because I just found out some interesting stuff about Maryland, but anyway, we have to spend a
Yeah.
different podcast episode on that.
Yeah, that's just in
Um,
my state, I'm aware.
yeah, I know, it's incredibly insane. I do, yes. My interpretation of everything I have studied and my ACS credential, studying at UNC, um, informed me that the language of counseling means that I am using my skills
Mhm,
in my work with my supervisee, but I am never their therapist.
mhm.
So my role is to say, it might be wise for, we can look at your countertransference. Let's take a look at how that parallel process, take a look at how that is working for, in that experience. So say, for example, a supervisee is going through a divorce and they see a client who is going through a divorce. So we're not going to just endorse you can't see that person because, I mean,
That's
it might be
unethical,
appropriate.
honestly.
Okay, it might in some circumstances be appropriate for them to refer. We don't know all the details. We're just
Yeah,
making this up off the top of our heads, right? But in all likelihood, it wouldn't be. So we're going to assume that for most, the circumstances are that they should continue to see them. So we're going to talk through, what are you experiencing that might be countertransference? What are you experiencing that might be similar? What are you experiencing that might be different? I'm not therapizing them. I'm not doing any active therapy around how are you navigating your experience with your spouse, your children, your in-laws, your parents, your attorney, blah blah blah. I'm not doing any of that. I'm not saying how is it feeling at the end of your relationship. I'm not doing any of that work.
right.
I am helping navigate how does your experience relate to your client's experience? How are you going to be able to put your experiences aside or in context to theirs? Is there an appropriate opportunity for self-disclosure? Is there not, etc.? And then I'm going to say, or I might say, are you in need of additional support to support your
Yeah,
to get clear on some of these things that are coming up for you, because you cannot fill from an empty cup.
right, or
We both
what is
know
this
that.
doing to your capacity? If this
Is
is
this right? Do
yeah,
you have the capacity? Not I'm not buying you out of this circumstance. I'm not saying
right.
you get a free pass. Do you have the capacity to support this person? Because if you don't, go get some therapy
That's right.
because you need it. And that is my job to see that for you.
Yep,
And if I'm not doing that, then I'm not a good coach.
yes.
So then let's go to the coaching role. So if I'm a coach and I see that you have a broken ankle, isn't
Right.
it my job to say you need to see an orthopedist?
Yes, or you're
Not
gonna
to
meet with a
say,
trainer before
right,
this next game.
exactly, you need to go to the trainer, you need to go to a nutritionist, you need to see somebody about your eyesight, all the things that have to do with your performance.
You're gonna get taped up before you get back on the field. You need to take a walk and do some things to regulate
Ex
yourself before you go into
Exactly.
that
Go
session.
to a therapist, right? Exactly. You need to go to the sports psychologist. Exactly. So I'm as the coach, that's my coaching role. But I know from my counseling role that I also need to do some work around the countertransference part, which I guarantee you, if you say the word countertransference to a coach, they're going to be like, humana, 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 like, what is that? And then my teaching role comes in here because I'm going to say something along the lines of, you know, how are you now going to navigate the skill development of understanding what is appropriate to disclose, what is not appropriate to disclose? Let's teach through that.
Yeah. I
And
think
that's a
what's
lot. That's a
it
lot of stuff to do.
it is, and let me add to
I'm
that because
tired just talking about it.
I know. I think this adds a totally different complex, like it adds complexity to what we do because and can be very nuanced and could look like therapy in a lot of ways if we're not careful. Is we're a trauma center. Like we treat nervous systems. It is the core of what we do. Attachment and nervous system work is the core of what we do. And you have to be embodied and show up in a way where your nervous system is where it needs to be and your attack like you have to be settled because people with trauma can sniff that out so quickly. And so we have to be cognizant of those things and talk about those things with our supervisees. And so it's very much an integral part of what we do. And yet, if we're not careful about that, it can very much slide into inappropriate places, like boundary wise.
Yeah. And also, let's be very clear, the word advice should never come up.
Hmm.
You know, I often have supervisees, and you know what? It occurred to me the other day, Valerie? I actually have active supervisees. So I need to talk to them about the fact that we have a podcast. Like,
You
I
haven't told them?
well, I did, but I can't I don't wanna say it. I mean, like, they're not doing anything wrong, but it just occurred to me that I might off the cuff say something like, "Oh, my supervisee said this," and then they
Yeah, yeah,
will hear
yeah,
me. So anyway, just note to self, we have to think about that. But anyway, so,
yeah.
but a supervisee said to me recently, "Can you give me some advice about this?" And I said, "No." She's like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "It's not my job to give you my role is not advice giving. My role is support providing." And they're like,
Mhm.
"Ew." I don't
Yeah,
want that. And I'm like, well, guess what? Your job, that's if I give you advice, that means I'm making the decision for you. And that isn't going to help you. Like this is a problem solving role thing. You're supposed to be problem solving, and I'm just here
yeah.
to sort of bolster you in doing that job. And they were like,
And
oh, it's so much.
uh-huh.
Like, I know it is. I know it is.
And even to add to that, when you are employing people and they're under your supervision, like we have an external supervisor also, so that there are checks and balances and we can balance some of that dual relationship. But I think it's on me, and I have to do this often because they will bring work related stuff into supervision. And sometimes it's relevant, and other times I'm like, that needs to be a check in with your team lead, or you need to put that on our team agenda. This is supervision. Other times it is part of the supervision process, but the feedback that they're seeking is not from the role of a supervisor. And so I have to switch hats, but I have to be very clear when I'm doing that. If I'm not clear in when I'm doing that, then they could think that that is very much a supervisor role when it's not.
A clinical supervisor versus a managerial supervisor role.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a whole series in and of itself because poor CSBs out here in the world, community services boards who have supervisors that have to have that dual role are very, very challenged by that. And
Mhm.
and frankly spend the majority of their time having to do managerial supervision. So that's a big, big conversation. Big
Mhm.
conversation. Let's take a minute. Can we go ahead and dive into the literature here? Because I think it could be really helpful. So, if we were going to look at thinking back on our own experience as supervisees, we want to kind of look at assessing our competence as a supervisee. We by kind of looking at these particular categories. So I'm going to kind of throw out a couple things. Um, we look for supervisees, we want to look at attitudes, preparation, and willingness to grow. And so, as we think about these things for supervisees, I want you to be thinking about yourself as a supervisor. So, even though this is true, and we want these things for supervisees, this is actually sort of a precursor to becoming a supervisor. So your attitude, preparation, willingness to grow. Your view of the supervision process, whether it is active, passive, goal oriented, collaborative. Your ability to admit to difficulties or to discuss errors, your skill at discussing issues or problems with the supervision relationship and to self critique, your openness to feedback, accepting it non defensively and giving feedback, your understanding of how personal dynamics relate to psychotherapy and supervision, as experienced by speaking openly about personal and emotional responses to clients, which we just talked about, countertransference, and your openness to multiple perspectives, client ratings of outcomes, and ethical and legal perspectives. So, that kind of idea, when we think about this comes from the supervision utilization form that is from Vespia et al. 2022 and cited in the reference text that we talked about in the beginning. And this sort of idea that this perspective is what we want supervisees to come into supervision with, but this is actually how we want supervisors to sort of
Mhm.
start to embody their role. Because
Right.
we all want people to come into the field of supervision remembering what it was like to be a supervisor
Mhm.
and having this starting place where they begin. And so I know that you've done, Valarie, a lot of really cool you've worked with some assessment instruments, and we're going to be sharing those in some upcoming episodes, and I think that those are going to be really helpful. I don't think a lot of supervisors think about, other than the prescripted assessments that we have to do quarterly and things like that, I don't think a lot of people think about assessment in supervision. Maybe to think about like evaluating their supervisee, but do you think supervisors on the whole think about having their supervisee evaluate them?
I don't because I never did that.
Ah,
In
neither did I.
in and
Nobody asked
but
me to.
I honestly don't know why anyone would do this role and not do that. But then again, I love data. I love assessment. I think it is a powerful tool. I think it's a beautiful tool. I think that it can show people where they're growing, where they need to grow. And, there's a lot of things that I have noticed and found in doing that with supervisees. And it can be as much as, they don't know what compassion fatigue looks like. They might have touched that one time. So
Right,
yeah, as a supervisor in the beginning, I might say, like, are you feeling any of this or this? No, I'm good. Only to realize later, I really think they're burning out, but they weren't convinced of their burnout. So
right,
if I had at that time, which I didn't, which is why I do now, had I given them this, all these different assessments that I use now, not only would it have paced our processes differently, but I would have had a baseline from which to draw from, and then a comparative analysis of an updated score to say, look, something is off, and we need to figure out what's shifting here because we do a lot of really heavy work. And these are things I say, and I'm looking out for your longevity. I'm not looking to get you just to licensure. Like I'm looking for the longevity. Like, we're wanting to grow a whole tree here, and this is a sprout. I'm not looking just to see the sprout and say, oh, you're licensed, great, you're done. No, 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 whole tree here. So even just being able to see that, it allows them to start, internalizing that process for themselves and then also modeling that and seeing that in their clinical work. So again, it's that
right,
whole modeling piece. If the idea is to show up in that way and model those things, why wouldn't we be modeling assessment as part of that when or values based, supervision practices when we really need evidence based care and assessment needs to be part of that and values based care. Like it doesn't make sense to me.
right.
So,
Well, so if we both had doctorates in counselor education and supervision, I mean, you're working towards your ACS. I have an ACS. So the ACS credential certainly gives you lots more exposure to assessment opportunities and assessment as a norm. But many, many, many supervisors in our field aren't first of all, supervisors aren't required to have any of that. And many, maybe even most, I might venture to say, supervisors in the counseling, social work, psychology fields don't have higher credentials in supervision. They certainly have, most have training, some little, some lots, but assessment is not the norm by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, I'm going to assert, and we're going to assert on Supervision Simplified, that assessment throughout the lifespan of supervision for licensure. And in fact, you know, I think assessment probably throughout the lifespan of your career is probably a pretty
No,
damn
I
good
do. Yeah,
idea.
even with my consultees, I
Yeah,
absolutely still do assessment.
yeah.
100%.
Because I probably could use a tune up. But in the meantime, through especially throughout your relationship as a supervisor is a great idea. And we're going to be adding in this episode and then in upcoming episodes a couple different examples from the literature of assessments. There are lots out there. There's a limited number of variables, maybe two or three. So we could probably share 20, but there would have maybe two or three differences. So there's no sense in over sharing too many examples. We'll probably just share two or three. But there are also a couple excellent programs that we'll be sharing as well that will give you some access to assessments. So I wanted to share some specific some specific changes that psychotherapists, that counselors, social workers undergo as they move into supervisor positions, and that these assessments specifically are looking at. So we kind of wanted to plant the seed for that. So the first one is, and this is kind of based on what we already talked about in terms of, kind of the process that you go through it as you sort of move into this field, but becoming able to perceive and act on complex response opportunities. We were talking about the multi layers of the clinician, the client, then your own responses. So it's
Mhm.
like triple levels or double levels of countertransference. Then learning to think like a supervisor, learning to think in that multi nuanced way of sort of protective, selective, collective. I just made that up, but just
I
kind
love
of
it.
this whole idea of you really have to think like I had a clinician the other day who was responding to an email and there was some concern regarding some custody issues. And I thought, I want her to respond, but I don't
Mhm.
want her to respond. And how does she respond? I want her to learn how to respond, but I also want her to learn that there's custodial issues to be considering. So, like all the
Yep.
things that you have to think about as a supervisor. Developing the ability to be oneself. I think that this is one that deserves a couple minutes to talk about. What do you think about that? Developing the ability to be oneself in supervision as a supervisor. How does that hit you?
Uh, well, I mean, I think, you know, I could see where that could. I think for some people, it's not going to be hard to be themselves, but I think that could be a risk too, because you may not be considering how you impact others or um, how your feedback influences others. And so, one of the things that I was recently reading and am going to change about the way I approach the very first maybe three supervision sessions with someone is going through and just talking about some of my own failures, like kind of normalizing some of
Mm,
those things as a supervisee and kind of helping normalize some of that stuff. And as I was thinking on that and reading about it, I was reflecting how it felt when my supervisor would give me like candid feedback. And I do remember it feeling very disruptive, like, and because I just had them on a pedestal and looked up to them so much and wanted to be like them. And yet I have to tell you, with all honesty, until I read that the other day and remembered that, there were so many times I would come out of supervision and I'm like, I don't know why they are trying so hard to please me. Like I've told them it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Like don't they understand I'm not going to be upset with them? So I think there's something to be said about us feeling like we bring ourselves into the room and that piece is clear. And that may not be exactly what you're talking about, but I think that there's something to be said around understanding just because of that power differential, the effect that even being yourself can have on someone, good or bad. And
yeah,
so
yeah,
that was something that just kept blowing my mind, like, and yet I knew it was a power, but I felt like I kept pulling myself down from the power and putting more accountability around me all the time to like continually try to bring that down. And yet there still seems to sometimes be this level of, just I'm held to this thing that, and I thought, well, maybe I should just normalize some of this and talk about some of those experiences that are still personal and who I am, but that's who I was as a student versus now.
Yeah.
Because we can lose sight. I know I can lose sight of how I got where I got and what it took to get there, and not in a prideful way, but just in a way of like forgetting to go back and bring those parts of myself into the room. And I think that that could be harmful when neglected
Yeah.
to the student.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned power because the next one is learning to understand and manage power. So we mentioned developing the ability to view oneself, learning to view oneself as a supervisor is the next one. Actually, so learning to understand and manage power, developing the capacity to use reflection as a tool to monitor one's biases and one's impact on others.
Mhm.
Developing confidence in one's judgment about what constitutes effective counseling. I think that that's a huge part of becoming a supervisor. On developing confidence in one's competence as a supervisor, patience with the process of supervisee development. That's kind of an easy one for me, I think, but maybe that's not as easy for everyone. Developing the courage to do the right thing in the gatekeeping role.
Oh, that one's easy for me.
The courage to do the
That one's
right thing.
probably almost too easy for me.
It's
Like,
really easy for me too, and it's really hard for a lot of people. So what
ah,
I'd like to invite us and our audience to do, and I know that we're wrapping up our time, but I would like to think about, I'm going to put these in our show notes, and I would love to invite us, you and I collectively, and then our audience to also do, is to really think about how they respond to each of these. And I'd love to have some conversations about how easy is it for people to learn to think like a supervisor, learn to view oneself as a supervisor. How hard is it to understand and manage power or to do the right thing in the gatekeeper role? And I'd love to have some conversations about that. And to invite some discussion because
mhm.
these are really big challenges and I think we should be talking about this a little bit more. What do you think, Valerie?
Yes, definitely. I think we should, and invite people to submit, send us an email, even if it's something you wanna, want us to answer or just discuss or share your own experience. I mean, I think we're always better together, like with the collective mind, and,
Absolutely.
our best resources are one another and our experiences. So we wanna hear from y'all too.
Absolutely. You can email us at hello vision. I was saying hello at Supervision Simplified. And we would love to hear from you. You can ask us questions. You can tell us how you're feeling about this role. You can tell us what you think about our Supervision Simplified podcast. You can also tell us what you think about wrestling and how you make your coffee in the morning. We'd love to hear
Yes.
from you. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Supervision Simplified. Remember, the revolution starts here. And we hope you'll subscribe to our podcast and that you'll share it with all your friends and colleagues. And as we said, we want your stories, your comments, and your feedback. And until next time, keep on simplifying and elevating your supervision game.